The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the neighborhood. Jaden walked briskly down the cracked sidewalk, his headphones draped around his neck, playing a muted beat. His thoughts were on the interview he had lined up at the local grocery store. He needed this job to help his mom with the bills. His senior year was already stressful enough, with the pressure of college applications and maintaining his grades, but the financial strain at home made everything feel even heavier. As he rounded the corner of Maple Street, where the buildings were older and the sidewalks more worn, something caught his eye. An elderly man was struggling with several heavy grocery bags, his frail frame leaning on a cane that looked just as old as he was. The man was clearly having a hard time, his face scrunched up in frustration as he tried to maintain his balance. Jaden hesitated. He was already running late, and he couldn't afford to miss this interview. But his mom had always taught him to respect his elders and help those in need. He glanced down at his phone, then back at the man. A sigh escaped his lips. "Hey, do you need some help?" Jaden called out, walking over to the man. The elderly man looked up, his blue eyes squinting as if trying to see Jaden clearly. "I've got it," he muttered, his tone gruff and unwelcoming. Jaden frowned. The old man clearly didn't have it. The bags were slipping from his grasp, and the cane looked like it might give out any second. Ignoring the man's protest, Jaden reached for the bags. "It's no trouble, really. Let me give you a hand." The man grunted, clearly not thrilled about accepting help, but too tired to argue. Jaden took the bags, surprised at how heavy they were. The man must have been struggling for a while. They walked in silence to the man's apartment building, a small, run-down complex that had seen better days. When they reached the front door, the man fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking slightly. Jaden waited patiently, shifting the bags in his arms. The man finally managed to unlock the door, and Jaden followed him inside. The apartment was small and cluttered, filled with old furniture and the smell of dust and stale air. The man pointed to the kitchen counter. "You can set them there," he said, his voice still curt. Jaden placed the bags down carefully, then turned to leave. "All right, take care," he said, heading towards the door. "Wait," the man called out, his tone softer now. Jaden turned around, expecting a thank you, but the old man just stared at him for a moment before looking away. "What's your name, kid?" "Jaden," he replied, trying to read the man's expression. "Jaden, huh? Well, thanks, I guess," the man mumbled, not quite meeting Jaden's eyes. "I'm Mr. Thompson." Jaden gave a small nod. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Thompson. Have a good evening." Without another word, Jaden left the apartment, closing the door gently behind him. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Mr. Thompson's coldness bothered him, but he brushed it off, focusing on getting to his interview. He didn't have time to dwell on it. Life was already throwing enough at him. Little did Jaden know, that brief encounter would set off a chain of events that would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. The grocery store interview didn't go as well as Jaden had hoped. The manager, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a permanent scowl, had barely looked at him during the interview, flipping through his resume with disinterest. Jaden knew the second he walked out of the store that he wouldn't be getting the job. The frustration gnawed at him as he made his way home, each step heavier than the last. As he trudged back down the familiar streets, the memory of Mr. Thompson's cold demeanor replayed in his mind. He had done something kind, something his mother would have been proud of, but instead of feeling good about it, he felt dismissed. It was as if his effort had meant nothing, a sentiment that felt all too familiar in a world that often overlooked him because of his age and skin color. By the time he got home, the sun had fully set, and the streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows on the pavement. His mom was still at work, pulling a double shift at the hospital, so the apartment was dark and quiet when he walked in. The small space they shared was modest but clean, with old furniture they had held on to for years because they couldn't afford to replace it. It was home, but it always felt like a reminder of the struggles they faced. Jaden threw his backpack on the couch and sank down beside it, rubbing his temples. He could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sounds of the city outside, but the quiet in the apartment felt heavy, almost oppressive. He pulled out his phone, scrolling mindlessly through social media, trying to distract himself from the gnawing sense of failure that was settling in his chest. His thoughts drifted back to Mr. Thompson again. The old man had seemed so lonely, so disconnected from everything around him. Jaden wondered what had made him that way. He had heard bits and pieces about Mr. Thompson from others in the neighborhood, how he had lost his wife a few years ago and had been living alone ever since. Some said he was a retired veteran, though no one seemed to know much about his life before he moved into the apartment building. Jaden sighed, tossing his phone aside. Maybe it wasn't worth thinking about. He had his own problems to deal with, like figuring out how to get a job and save up for college. He couldn't afford to waste time worrying about some grumpy old man who probably didn't want his help anyway. But even as he tried to push the thoughts away, they kept creeping back in. Maybe it was because Jaden knew what it felt like to be underestimated, to be seen as just another kid from the neighborhood who wouldn't amount to much. He had worked hard to prove people wrong, to show that he was more than just his circumstances. And maybe, in some way, he saw a bit of that same struggle in Mr. Thompson. The next day, Jaden woke up to a gray sky and the sound of rain pattering against the window. It was the kind of day that made everything feel a little heavier, a little more difficult. He got dressed and grabbed a piece of toast on his way out the door, not particularly hungry, but knowing he needed something in his stomach. As he walked to school, the rain began to pick up, soaking through his hoodie and making the walk feel twice as long. By the time he reached the front steps of the school, he was dripping wet, and his mood was just as miserable as the weather. The day dragged on, with each class blurring into the next. Jaden found it hard to focus, his mind still wrapped up in the events of the previous day. When the final bell rang, he felt a sense of relief, eager to get home and put the day behind him. On his way back, he passed by Mr. Thompson's building again. He hesitated for a moment, glancing up at the window he knew belonged to the old man. The curtains were drawn, and there was no sign of movement inside. Jaden was about to keep walking when the front door opened, and Mr. Thompson stepped out, wearing a thick coat and holding an umbrella. Jaden paused, unsure of whether to approach or just keep walking. Before he could decide, Mr. Thompson looked up and spotted him. For a moment, neither of them said anything, the rain filling the silence between them. Finally, Thompson gave a small nod, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Afternoon, Jaden," he said, his voice carrying a hint of warmth that hadn't been there the day before. "Afternoon, Mr. Thompson," Jaden replied, a bit surprised by the greeting. Mr. Thompson didn't say anything more, just stood there for a moment before he started walking down the street. Jaden watched him go, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Relief that the old man hadn't completely ignored him, but also curiosity about what had changed. As he continued his walk home, Jaden couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Mr. Thompson than he had originally thought. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something unexpected. The rain had stopped by the time Jaden finished his homework that evening. He sat at the small kitchen table, the light from the overhead lamp casting a warm glow over the scattered papers and textbooks. His mind was still on Mr. Thompson and the unexpected nod of acknowledgement from earlier. Something about it had stirred his curiosity, making it hard to focus on anything else. Jaden's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. His mother, weary from her double shift, stepped inside, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. She offered him a tired smile as she set her bag down on the worn-out couch. "Hey, honey, how was your day?" she asked, her voice tinged with fatigue. "It was all right," Jaden replied, not wanting to burden her with his worries. "Just school, you know?" She nodded, not pressing further. She knew her son well enough to understand when he didn't want to talk. After heating up some leftovers for dinner, they sat together at the table in comfortable silence, sharing a meal and the warmth of each other's company. Later that night, as Jaden lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something more. He wasn't sure what, but he felt like he had to reach out to Mr. Thompson again. Maybe it was the way the old man had looked at him, like he had something to say but wasn't sure how. Or maybe it was just that Jaden felt a connection to him despite their differences. The next day after school, Jaden found himself standing outside Mr. Thompson's building again. This time he didn't hesitate. He walked up to the front door and rang the buzzer. A crackling voice came through the intercom after a moment. "Who is it?" "It's Jaden," he replied, suddenly unsure of what to say next. "I was just wondering if you needed any help with anything." There was a long pause, and Jaden began to think he had made a mistake. But then the door buzzed, and he heard the latch click open. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. Mr. Thompson was waiting for him in the hallway, leaning slightly on his cane. His expression was unreadable, but he didn't seem upset. If anything, he looked almost relieved. "Come on up," he said, turning to lead the way up the narrow staircase. Jaden followed, the creak of the old stairs the only sound in the otherwise quiet building. When they reached Mr. Thompson's apartment, the old man gestured for Jaden to take a seat in the small living room. The space was cluttered, but there was a sense of history to it. Photographs of people and places that Jaden didn't recognize, but that clearly meant something to Mr. Thompson. Jaden sat down on the edge of an armchair, feeling slightly out of place. Mr. Thompson shuffled over to the kitchen and returned with 2 cups of tea, setting one down in front of Jaden before lowering himself into the chair opposite. "Thanks," Jaden said, taking the cup carefully. He wasn't much of a tea drinker, but he appreciated the gesture. Mr. Thompson sipped his tea in silence for a moment before finally speaking. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low but steady. "I wasn't very kind to you the other day when you helped me with the groceries. I'm not used to people going out of their way for me." Jaden was taken aback. He hadn't expected an apology, and certainly not one so sincere. "It's okay, really," he said quickly. "You didn't have to apologize." "Yes, I did," Mr. Thompson insisted, his gaze softening. "I've been alone for a long time, and I guess I forgot how to accept kindness. It's not something that comes easily to me anymore." Jaden nodded, unsure of what to say. He could sense that there was more to Mr. Thompson's story, something deeper that he wasn't quite ready to share. But the fact that he was even opening up a little was a start. They sat in silence for a few more minutes, the steam rising from their cups of tea. Jaden felt a strange sense of calm in the room, as if they were both slowly starting to understand each other. Finally, Mr. Thompson spoke again. "Jaden, do you have any plans after high school?" he asked, his tone more curious than prying. Jaden hesitated, then sighed. "I've applied to a few colleges, but I don't know if I'll get in. And even if I do, I'm not sure how I'll pay for it. My mom's doing everything she can, but money's tight, and I don't want to put more pressure on her." Mr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully, as if he had expected that answer. "It's tough, trying to make a future for yourself when the odds are stacked against you. But you're a smart kid, Jaden. I can see that. And I think you've got a lot of potential." Jaden looked up, surprised by the compliment. "Thanks," he said quietly, not sure what else to say. Mr. Thompson set his cup down and leaned forward slightly. "I've been around a long time, and I've seen a lot of things. I've also made a lot of connections over the years. If you want, I can help you with those college applications. Maybe even make a few calls, see if I can put in a good word for you." Jaden's eyes widened in shock. "You'd do that for me?" he asked, almost unable to believe what he was hearing. "Of course," Mr. Thompson replied, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's the least I can do after the way I treated you. And besides, I'd like to see you succeed, Jaden. You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago. Someone who had big dreams but didn't always have the support he needed." Jaden felt a lump form in his throat. He had never expected anything like this when he first decided to help Mr. Thompson with his groceries. The idea that this man, who seemed so closed off from the world, would offer to help him achieve his dreams was overwhelming. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," Jaden said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Mr. Thompson replied, his smile widening just a bit. "Just let me help. We'll work on those applications together, and we'll see what we can do to get you where you want to be." As they sat together, planning out the next steps, Jaden felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to look up. Over the next few days, a routine developed that neither Jaden nor Mr. Thompson had anticipated. Each afternoon after school, Jaden would stop by Mr. Thompson's apartment. The old man would greet him at the door, and they would spend the next couple of hours working on college applications. It was a strange partnership at first, an unlikely pairing of a young black teen and an elderly white man, but somehow it worked. Jaden found that Mr. Thompson had a wealth of knowledge, not just about the application process, but about life in general. He had stories to share, bits of wisdom that he had picked up over his many years. As they worked, Mr. Thompson would occasionally pause to tell Jaden about his experiences, how he had grown up during the Great Depression, fought in World War II, and built a life after the war that had been full of both triumphs and tragedies. Jaden listened with rapt attention, realizing that there was much more to Mr. Thompson than he had originally thought. The old man wasn't just a grumpy recluse. He was someone who had lived through some of the most pivotal moments in history. And despite the hardships he had faced, he had managed to carve out a life for himself, a life that had left him with both deep scars and profound insights. One afternoon, after they had finished another round of application essays, Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair and let out a long sigh. "You know, Jaden," he began, his voice thoughtful, "I used to be a lot like you. I had dreams, ambitions, but life doesn't always go the way you plan." Jaden looked up from his notes, curious. "What happened?" he asked gently. Mr. Thompson was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the gray sky. "I had a family once," he said softly. "A wife, 2 children, they were my world, but I lost them. First my wife to cancer, then my son and daughter in a car accident. After that, I didn't see much point in anything anymore." Jaden's heart sank at the pain in Mr. Thompson's voice. He had never imagined the old man had suffered such profound losses. "I'm so sorry," Jaden whispered, not knowing what else to say. Mr. Thompson shook his head, as if to clear the memories away. "It was a long time ago," he said, his voice firmer now. "But that's why I keep to myself. It's easier, you know, easier than opening up to people and risking more loss." Jaden nodded, understanding more about Mr. Thompson's solitary nature than he ever had before. It also explained why the old man had been so reluctant to accept help at first. He had built walls around himself, walls that had taken years to construct, and it was only now that Jaden was beginning to see through the cracks. "I'm glad you decided to open up to me," Jaden said sincerely. "I know it can't be easy, but I'm really grateful for everything you're doing to help me." Mr. Thompson smiled faintly. "You've helped me more than you know, Jaden," he replied. "You've given me a reason to care again, a reason to get up in the morning. That's something I haven't had in a long time." The words hung in the air, and Jaden felt a surge of emotion. He had never thought that helping an elderly man with his groceries would lead to this, a friendship that was changing both of their lives. As the days went on, their bond deepened. Mr. Thompson made good on his promise to help with the college applications, even reaching out to some of his old contacts. He wrote a glowing recommendation letter for Jaden, highlighting not just his academic achievements, but also his character, his determination, and his kindness. One day, as they were wrapping up their work, Mr. Thompson handed Jaden a letter. "This came for you today," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Jaden took the letter, his hands trembling slightly. It was from one of the colleges he had applied to, the one he had always dreamed of attending. He tore open the envelope, his heart pounding in his chest as he scanned the contents. His breath caught in his throat. He had been accepted. Not only that, but they were offering him a full scholarship. I got in," Jaden stammered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Mr. Thompson, I got in." Mr. Thompson beamed, the pride in his eyes unmistakable. "I knew you would," he said with confidence. "You've worked hard, Jaden. You've earned this." Jaden felt tears welling up in his eyes. He had dreamed of this moment for so long, but he had never imagined it would feel this overwhelming, this incredible. He wanted to jump for joy, to shout out to the world, but all he could do was stand there, holding the letter and feeling the weight of everything it represented. "Thank you," Jaden finally managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you." Mr. Thompson reached out and placed a hand on Jaden's shoulder. "You did this, Jaden," he said firmly. "I just gave you a little push. The rest was all you." As they stood there, the gravity of the moment settling in, Jaden realized that his life was about to change in ways he had only dreamed of. And it was all because of a small act of kindness, because he had stopped to help a grumpy old man with his groceries. But there was still one more surprise in store, one that neither of them could have anticipated. A surprise that would reveal just how much of an impact their unlikely friendship had made. The excitement from the acceptance letter lingered in Jaden's mind for days, fueling his steps with a new sense of purpose. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future looked bright, and the burdens he had carried for so long seemed lighter. But even as the joy of his achievement filled his heart, he couldn't help but think of Mr. Thompson and how much the old man had become a part of his life. One Saturday morning, just a week after receiving the letter, Jaden decided to pay Mr. Thompson an unexpected visit. He wanted to share more of his plans, to talk about the future, and most importantly, to thank him again for everything he had done. But when he arrived at Mr. Thompson's apartment, something felt off. The door was slightly ajar, which was unusual. Mr. Thompson was always careful about locking up, a habit born from years of living alone. Jaden's stomach tightened with unease as he pushed the door open a little further and called out, "Mr. Thompson?" There was no response. Jaden stepped inside cautiously. The apartment was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made his heart race. As he moved further into the living room, he noticed that Mr. Thompson's cane was resting against the arm of the chair, but there was no sign of the old man himself. "Mr. Thompson?" Jaden called again, louder this time. His voice echoed slightly in the stillness. He turned the corner into the small kitchen and froze. Mr. Thompson was slumped over the table, his head resting on his folded arms. For a terrifying moment, Jaden's mind went blank, and all he could do was stare, paralyzed by fear. "Mr. Thompson!" Jaden rushed to his side, shaking the old man's shoulder gently but urgently. "Mr. Thompson, wake up!" Slowly, Mr. Thompson stirred, lifting his head groggily. His eyes were glassy, and he seemed disoriented, as if he wasn't entirely sure where he was. "Jaden," he mumbled, his voice weak and frail. What are you doing here?" Jaden let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, relief washing over him. "I came to see you, but you didn't answer the door. Are you okay?" Mr. Thompson blinked a few times, trying to clear the fog from his mind. I'm sorry, son. I must have dozed off." He attempted to sit up straighter, but his movements were slow and shaky. Jaden frowned, concern etching deeper lines into his young face. "You don't look so good. Maybe you should see a doctor." Mr. Thompson waved a dismissive hand, though the effort seemed to cost him. "I'm fine, just a little tired. It's nothing to worry about." But Jaden wasn't convinced. The old man looked pale, more so than usual, and there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I think you should rest," Jaden insisted. "I can stay here with you if you want." For a moment, Mr. Thompson looked like he was going to argue, but then he sighed, too exhausted to put up a fight. "All right," he conceded quietly. "Just for a little while." Jaden helped him back to his chair in the living room, where Mr. Thompson leaned back and closed his eyes. The old man seemed to fall asleep almost instantly, and Jaden sat nearby, keeping a close watch over him, worry gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Time passed slowly, each minute stretching into what felt like an hour. Jaden couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong, but he didn't want to leave Mr. Thompson alone to get help. Instead, he sat there in the stillness, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Thompson stirred again, this time waking up with more alertness. He looked over at Jaden and managed a weak smile. "You're still here," he said softly, his voice touched with gratitude. "Of course I am," Jaden replied, relieved to see the old man looking a little better. "I wasn't going to leave you alone." Mr. Thompson nodded, then slowly sat up, though it took considerable effort. "Jaden, there's something I need to tell you," he said, his tone serious. "Something I've been meaning to share with you for a while now." Jaden leaned in closer, sensing the importance of what Mr. Thompson was about to say. "What is it?" Mr. Thompson took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to speak. "You've been a blessing to me, Jaden. he began, his voice steady despite the frailty in his body. "You've given me a reason to keep going when I had just about given up, and I want to make sure you know how much that means to me." Jaden felt a lump rise in his throat, but he didn't interrupt, sensing that Mr. Thompson had more to say. "Before I go, I want you to have something," Mr. Thompson continued, his eyes locking onto Jaden's with an intensity that made the young man's heart pound. "It's something I've held on to for years, something that I thought I'd never need again." Jaden's brow furrowed in confusion as Mr. Thompson reached into a drawer beside his chair and pulled out a small, worn envelope. He handed it to Jaden with trembling hands. "What is this?" Jaden asked, carefully taking the envelope. "Open it," Mr. Thompson urged, his voice soft but insistent. With shaky hands, Jaden opened the envelope and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. As he unfolded it, his eyes widened in shock. It was a deed to a house. "I want you to have this," Mr. Thompson said, his voice filled with emotion. "It's the house I lived in with my family before everything changed. I've held on to it all these years, but I don't need it anymore. I want you to have a fresh start, Jaden, a place where you can build your future." Jaden was speechless. He stared at the deed, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what Mr. Thompson was giving him. I can't accept this," he stammered. "This is too much." Mr. Thompson shook his head, a gentle smile on his lips. "It's not too much, Jaden. It's exactly what you deserve. You've worked hard, and you've shown more kindness and compassion than most people ever will. I want to give you something that will help you on your journey, something that will remind you that there's always hope, even when life seems darkest." Tears welled up in Jaden's eyes, and he didn't try to hide them. "Thank you," he whispered, overwhelmed by the generosity and love that Mr. Thompson had shown him. "Thank you so much." Mr. Thompson reached out and took Jaden's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You're a good kid, Jaden. Don't ever forget that, and don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise." As they sat together, the weight of the moment settled in. Jaden knew that this was more than just a gift. It was a legacy, a reminder of the bond they had formed, and a symbol of the future that lay ahead. In the days that followed, Jaden couldn't stop thinking about the deed that Mr. Thompson had given him. The old man's health seemed to be on a slow decline, and though Jaden continued to visit him daily, their conversations grew shorter, often punctuated by long silences. But the bond between them had never been stronger, and Jaden felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the friendship that had blossomed between them. One afternoon, as Jaden sat by Mr. Thompson's side, the old man handed him a small, weathered key. "This is for the house," Mr. Thompson said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not far from here. I want you to go see it, to make it your own." Jaden looked at the key, feeling the weight of its significance. "I will, Mr. Thompson, I promise." Mr. Thompson nodded, a look of peace settling over his features. "Good. It's time for you to start your new life, Jaden. And don't worry about me. I'll be all right." Jaden stayed with him until the evening, talking softly about the future, about the college he would attend, the career he hoped to pursue, and the life he wanted to build. Mr. Thompson listened with a contented smile, his eyes reflecting the pride he felt for the young man who had become like a grandson to him. A few days later, Jaden decided it was time to visit the house. He took the bus across town, the small key clutched tightly in his hand. As the bus rolled through unfamiliar streets, Jaden's mind raced with thoughts of what the house might look like, what memories it might hold. When the bus finally stopped, Jaden stepped off and found himself standing in front of a modest but well-kept house. The yard was a little overgrown, but the house itself had a welcoming, almost nostalgic charm. It was the kind of place that felt like home even before you stepped inside. Jaden approached the front door, his heart pounding with anticipation. He inserted the key into the lock, and with a deep breath, he turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a cozy living room filled with the warmth of the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. As Jaden stepped inside, he was struck by the sense of history that seemed to fill the air. The furniture was old but sturdy, the walls adorned with photographs and paintings that hinted at the life Mr. Thompson had once lived here. It was a home that had seen love, laughter, and loss, a home that had been waiting for someone to fill it with new memories. Jaden walked through the house, taking in each room with a mixture of awe and reverence. He could imagine Mr. Thompson here with his family, could almost hear the echoes of conversations long past. But now, this house was his, a place where he could build his own future, just as Mr. Thompson had intended. As he explored the house, Jaden found a small, dusty box tucked away in a closet. Inside were old photographs, letters, and keepsakes, remnants of a life well lived. Jaden carefully sifted through them, feeling a deep connection to the man who had given him this incredible gift. It was as if Mr. Thompson had left behind a piece of himself, a legacy that Jaden was now a part of. Over the next few weeks, Jaden spent every spare moment at the house, cleaning, repairing, and making it his own. His mother was overwhelmed with emotion when she saw it, tears of joy streaming down her face as she embraced her son. "I'm so proud of you, Jaden," she whispered, holding him tight. "You've worked so hard, and now look at what you've accomplished." Jaden smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom, and without Mr. Thompson." They stood together in the doorway, looking out at the neighborhood that was now their new home. Jaden knew that this was just the beginning of his journey, but it was a journey he was ready to take, with his mother by his side and Mr. Thompson's memory guiding him. But even as Jaden settled into his new life, there was one last chapter to be written. One afternoon, Jaden received a call from Mr. Thompson's neighbor. The old man had passed away peacefully in his sleep. Jaden's heart ached with the loss, but he found comfort in knowing that Mr. Thompson had lived his final days with the knowledge that he had made a difference in Jaden's life. The funeral was small, attended by a few neighbors and friends who had known Mr. Thompson over the years. Jaden stood by the graveside, his head bowed in respect, his mind filled with memories of the man who had become so much more than just a neighbor. He had been a mentor, a friend, and a guiding light in a world that often felt dark. As the service came to a close, Jaden placed a single white rose on the grave, a symbol of the purity and sincerity of their bond. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you for everything." In the weeks that followed, Jaden honored Mr. Thompson's memory by living the life the old man had believed he could have. He excelled in college, making friends, earning top grades, and pursuing his dreams with the same determination that had impressed Mr. Thompson. The house became a sanctuary, a place where Jaden could study, reflect, and build the future that Mr. Thompson had seen in him. And though Mr. Thompson was gone, his presence remained a constant in Jaden's life. Every time Jaden opened the front door, every time he sat in the living room and looked at the photographs on the wall, he felt the old man's spirit guiding him, reminding him of the power of kindness, the importance of hope, and the lasting impact one person can have on another. Jaden knew that his life had been forever changed by a chance encounter, by a small act of kindness that had grown into something much bigger. And as he looked out at the world with new eyes, he knew that he would carry Mr. Thompson's legacy with him, sharing it with others, and making sure that the old man's gift would continue to inspire for generations to come. The story of a black teen who helped an elderly white man and in return received not just a house, but a new future was one that would be told and retold, a story of friendship, redemption, and the enduring power of human connection.